message here is that each and every one of you will have constructed your own personal representation of that piece of text. This may or may not be in line with the authors, with mine, or with the interpretations of others. And I think this is one of the key messages I want to get across today, is that it's a very personal thing, the relationship that we have with text. I'm going to explore that with one more question. Where was the tinny voice coming from? Where was the tinny voice coming from? Okay. There are multiple possible interpretations that you might reach based on the information that is present in that text and the information that you have available to you from your own experiences. Now, that piece of text was set, like most of my life, in the 1990s. I'm a 90s girl. It was based on a trip home for me, back to my family home. And so I have a very clear picture in my mind of what I was writing about. And what I was writing about was this, a clock radio. Wasn't quite as fancy as that, actually. That's pretty fancy. But, of course, if you didn't share that space with me, if you didn't have the same context to draw on, if you don't have the same experiences, the same considerations, etc., then you could come up with many different interpretations of the tinny voice. It could be coming from a mobile phone. It would have done in the 90s. We didn't have such technology. Could come from a TV set. Television set might be set to come on in the morning. If you let your imagination go a bit further, there's no reason to think that it couldn't be coming from a toy robot. You've got the tinny sound. Makes some sense. So, taking that into account, the question becomes who's correct? Whose interpretation is the right one? Is it mine as the writer? Or is it one of these people's? Is it this person because theirs is most closely matched to what I intended? Or do we need to take the wider view of how we comprehend and how we judge and assess people's comprehension skills? So I'm just going to take a moment to share some frustration. When we look at some common ways, I'm not saying these are the only ways, there are many ways, but when we look at some common ways in which we assess and in which we ask children, young people, learners about their comprehension, so very often we are expecting a correct answer. We are expecting a right answer. There's a restricted choice and one of them must be correct. So where was Jenny? Well, I know she was at her parents' house. But she could have been at a caravan, at a mansion, on a boat. It was December. Well, yes, in my mind it was. But equally, whilst it's cold in December in Suffolk, in the middle of nowhere, actually, if your background is not the same, if you come from a different country, another part of the world, December, and the weather is likely to be very different. Jenny felt, now we use this type of approach quite a lot, this closed procedure. Jenny felt something when she sprang upright. And often, learners are asked to select from a set of words which one's the correct one. Most commonly in the research that we've done and some of the assessments that I've been involved in, we tend to see these open-ended questions. Why was Jenny kneeling? So there's a sense of, there's a space to provide your own interpretation, but ultimately that then gets scored and graded. So you would get a certain number of points according to how well it aligns with the expected. So that was just a sort of moment, and it's something that I think a lot about, because I think that there's a danger in looking at how we assess, in looking at standardised measures, in looking at tests that we use in schools, and assuming that that's just, that's going to be a strong measure. These have their place, absolutely do, but they have their particular place and may only be telling us about one particular part of comprehension. So it was good to see this morning already mention of this paper. So this is the paper by Castles, Russell and Nation about ending the reading wars. And there's a really good section on comprehension. So I want to just share with you the little snippet that I find very valuable. reading comprehension is multifaceted. To understand its complexities, we need to consider the range of linguistic and cognitive processes that are implicated in text comprehension, and appreciate how these depend on children's knowledge, as well as the features of the text itself, and the purpose and goals of the reading situation, why you're doing that reading in the first place. And over the next few slides, I hope to unpack some of this. So, I love a theory. I'm a psychologist. I love theories. And actually, theories can be very, very useful. And what I hope to do in the work that I do, and I hope to do in events like this, is convince people that theories can be very useful, and that they can be useful not only in helping us to describe, but also in helping us to ask useful questions. So we can use frameworks to have discussions, to think about areas that you might want to work on, or priorities for future practice or future research. So they frame the skills and the processes, but they also help us ask useful questions about how best to support learning. So earlier on this morning, for those that were here at the welcome address, we saw the simple view of reading. And the simple view of reading proposes that in order to be a successful reader, to read with meaning, you need to be able to decode text, but you also need to be able to comprehend it. And we have these broad elements of word recognition and language comprehension. Now this version of this is a sort of an expanded version, if you like, of the simple view. This is from Scarborough in 2001, it's called the Reading Rope. And this unpacks a little more about what we mean by these two broad areas of skill. So in terms of language comprehension, what comes under that umbrella? Well, background knowledge, drawn from our experiences, vocabulary, knowledge and language structure, our ability to reason verbally, make inferences and so on, and knowledge of literacy and literacy practices. And then under the word recognition part of the rope, we have sight recognition, decoding and phonological awareness. And to really understand reading, it's argued that you have to think about all of these together, and not only as individual components, but also about how they interweave and interlink. So the reading rope and the simple view can help us look very broadly at the skills involved in reading. The model I'm going to share with you now focuses in, places the lens more closely on the comprehension element of reading. So it's called the construction integration model, big fancy long words. It makes sense though, I think, and hopefully I'll convince you of that as we go through it. So it's about constructing, so it's about building, but it's all about linking, it's about integrating, bringing things together. So according to Kinch and Rawson, who developed this model, when we seek to comprehend text, when we engage with meaning, we build what's called a text base. So from the text itself, we have layers of interpretation and analysis that we do when we encounter the text. So that can take place at the linguistic level, so we can be looking at individual words and their meanings. In the case of the passage that I wrote, words like disorientation, stumbled, gown, delivering, harsh, rifled. If you don't have secure representation or knowledge of those words, then you're going to struggle to make sense of them in the context of that text. So that word level analysis and that word level inquiry is really important. The next level analysis, the next level of information that you can glean from the text itself is called its microstructure. So these are larger chunks of text. So these might be phrases or sentences or bits of speech, perhaps. So in the case of the text I shared with you, a "to sweat a day" could be considered to be a phrase. It's a phrase in my mind that represents it's really cold and I have to sweat a day. The next level of analysis is at the macro level, the macro structure. So this is where you look at the text and you can recognise things about that text. So you can see that it's fiction or non-fiction. You can see that it might be narrative or it might be different forms of prose or whatever it might be. You can see that it's structured within paragraph. So there's a lot you can get from the page, there's a lot that you can get from the text itself. But if you only work at that level of analysis, and if you only take that information from the text, then Kinch and Rawson argue that your understanding is going to be very surface level and shallow. So, can you tell I love clip art? I've got a little bit overexcited. Anyway, this clip art here is to demonstrate the second part of the model. So in the second part of the model, we have our general knowledge. We have a wide variety of life experiences that we've amassed and that we have in our minds to draw from. These might be from our friendships, our family groups, it might be from schooling, it might be from reading, watching TV, etc., etc. We glean information from all sorts of sources. With relation to the text I showed you, here are some of the things where if you have certain experiences, you might be able to make links to that text. So what your experience of sleep might be, your experience of family, clothing, home, seasons, holidays, weather. There are many kind of broader concepts and ideas that if you have that rich life experience and that rich general knowledge, you can then bring that to that text to help you make sense of it. So, the next part of this model, the final part, is about how we integrate and construct our representation. So we take the information from the text, we have our information in our minds from our experiences, and what we build is what's called a situation model. It's like a snapshot, it's like your own personal situation with that text. It's a personal and an emotional response to the text. You can probably tell I've got a 5-year-old. I spend a lot of time building little models like this. But actually it's not a bad visual representation of what we're talking about. We're talking about linkage of knowledge, linkage of information, and it's an ever-growing, ever-changing potential model of our understanding. And importantly, it's personal, it's emotional. So taking this framework then, taking this theory, what does that then tell us for practice and for how we might go about supporting learners with their comprehension? Well, it tells us that we ought to be spending time with text and really getting to know text and looking at it and thinking about it. Very close inspection of text. But importantly, it says, we ought to be really also spending lots of time thinking about our knowledge and our experiences and what we bring to the text, what each and every learner brings to the text. It also suggests that the methods that we use ought to be promoting and making explicit those links between text and knowledge. And it also suggests that we ought to really acknowledge and explore the personal nature of representation. So, many things can influence how our internal model is built and how we construct that model. And I'm going to talk through some of the key things now. So, one really important thing to consider is working memory. So in order to be able to keep track of text, to make those links, to process all of that information, actually it requires quite a lot of mental effort, quite a lot of cognitive work. So your working memory can be really very important. Working memory is very temporary, operates very quickly, it's attention driven, you have to be paying attention to the information in order to process that information. But as we see, Kane and O'Kill in particular highlight this as being really important in bringing together the text base and your general knowledge. Inference making. I could have done a whole presentation on inference making, it's super fascinating. And it covers lots of different areas. So, your ability to make inferences is going to have an influence on the model that you create. So it's how you guess, how you make predictions, how you link things, how you evaluate. And Kinch and Rawson talk about this, and they say, well, to build your model, you're going to be constructing at lots of levels of analysis. You might need to make inferences about the characters in the story. You might need to make inferences about the author and their intended message and their position. There's all sorts of ways in which you might be engaging inferential processing. And what's interesting is that we can think about some inferences that happen automatically. And when I did that exercise with you and showed you the story and asked you some questions, many people come straight back and I could hear that you've got an answer almost straight away. So many inferences happen almost without us knowing that we're doing it, automatically as we're reading. Our brains are kind of connecting things up. But sometimes, actually, the inference process is much more effortful, controlled, and takes more time, and happens after the main reading has happened. So there's lots to think about. There are also lots of different types, and I'm not going to go into too much detail of this information, but just to sort of indicate that there are lots of types. So some that require the text itself, some that require knowledge, some that involve bridging, that involves linking together pieces of text that are perhaps very disparately spaced, evaluating outcomes of events, predicting what might be happening next. I mean, there's many, so I won't labour that bit, it's just to give an indication. Closely linked to inference making is perspective taking, or theory of mind skills. Being able to recognise the minds of others, mind read. Whenever people say, oh, you're a psychologist, can you mind read? No, kind of. Actually, yes, I can, because we all mind read all the time. We're all making predictions and about people's understanding and recognising their thoughts, wishes and feelings of others. So when we're reading, we might be thinking about the character's thoughts, their mental state, their feelings. But there are other more complicated levels of theory of mind where this person might be thinking about what this person is thinking about. Or this person might be thinking about what this person has been thinking about this person. We have multiple layers of reflection upon what we're thinking about what other people are thinking. Yeah. But that really comes to play when we're reading. Potentially, there's many different layers of this happening. And then this is where I love this picture, because actually this all links into metacognition. Quite a buzzword, you will have heard it no doubt, people talk about this a lot at the moment. It's the ability to think about your own thinking. Thinking about what we know, thinking about what we know about what we know, and being able to really reflect on our own experiences and knowledge base and processing. And this is really important, because if you're reading a text, it's good to check in with yourself every now and again to see if you've actually understood it. I'm sure, many times I'll open a book and I feel 10 pages in and I suddenly think, oh, I've just been planning my shopping list or something else. I don't know, I've no idea what I've just read. So actually that metacognition and that engagement with the text is really important. And then this links us to a concept called standards of coherence. Now I think this is quite a useful one. I personally think about this quite a lot. Professor Randall and O'Connor introduced this idea. So when we read something, we will set ourselves a standard, a bar, by which we're willing to accept mistakes, willing to accept errors, willing to accept things that we don't understand. So there's a graded level by which that happens. So if we start at the bottom, I always think of this one as, if I'm waiting in a doctor's waiting room, and there's a magazine there that's from, 2012, and I'm sat there reading and it's, something I wouldn't want to pick up. And actually, I'm just doing it to fill in some time. Actually, I'm not really worried about whether I've understood it or not. So I might set my standard of coherence quite low. And I might be willing to let loads of things pass by, but actually, I don't need to understand it. However, if you work your way through this, and sort of end up at the place where I think of this sort of top run, if I'm cooking, I'm in the kitchen, and wanting to follow a recipe, actually I want to read that pretty carefully. I want to set my standard pretty high. I want to make sure that I don't miss anything, because that could end in disaster. Food poisoning, who knows? So actually I'm going to be setting my standard at a different place. So we're always doing this, we're thinking about where we're setting our standards, and it varies across individuals, and it varies across the context and the purpose of why we're reading. And that takes us to the sort of final part of this section, which is thinking about, well, reading doesn't happen in a bubble, it happens within a context. We have certain purposes for our reading, and I've tried to summarise a few there, but of course there are many more. So when we think about reading and how best to support learners and thinking about their comprehension processes, it's important to recognise the text that they're reading, why they've been asked to read it, or why they've chosen to read that text, and everything that surrounds that, so all the values that surround the child, the messages that the child has received, the cultural messages about reading and the importance of reading and why we read and what reading's all about. There's many things that potentially could have a role to play in somebody's comprehension of that text. So, I'll pass. That's good. Okay. Yeah. I'm shaking so much today. Sorry about that. God, it's really hard. It's my job. I give lectures all the time. It's really hard. Okay, so I'm now going to turn attention to thinking about what all that means for how we go about supporting learners to understand text. Now, my area of research is exactly this. So I work with teaching assistants and teachers, mainly at the upper end of primary school and going into the early stages of secondary school. And we develop packages of support to be used with individual children or pairs of children usually, to help them to engage with making meaning from text. So if you look at the research literature and look at what's available as an evidence base, then broadly speaking, we can sort of see approaches in two areas. So there are some approaches that focus on helping learners to develop strategies. And this might be to do with making inferences, asking questions, the metacognitive strategies. And then there are other approaches that focus primarily on that close inspection of the text. That real careful looking at the language and thinking about the phrasing and so on. Typically, what you see actually, more often than not, is a combination of these strategy and content approaches. And I always like this sort of idea of a toolkit. And when I work with schools, I talk about what we're providing you here with and what we're hoping that the learners will take from this is a set of tools that they can use, and they can choose what they use and what they don't use, but we want to provide you with a comprehensive set of tools that might be valuable to learners. So Duke and Pearson speak about this as it being a balanced approach, and it should include both explicit instruction in comprehension strategies and a great deal of time actually working with texts. There's my book. Don't expect to buy it. Please don't feel under pressure to buy it. So this is not just mine. So this is some work that we did a few years ago now. So it's myself, Emma Truelove, Charles Hume and Maggie Snowling. We were really fortunate to get some funding from the ESRC, which was, I can't tell you how important that is to this project. So what that funding allowed us to do was actually pay for the teaching assistants' time, class teachers' time, to come and get involved in the project and to deliver support to pupils. Really difficult to get that kind of funding now, but at the time, we got it. And what we show in this book, if anyone's interested, is the process that we went through in developing some intervention methods. It shows you the research evidence and the findings, and it also talks about sort of implications going forward. What I'm going to do over the next few slides is sort of distill some of the things that I would really like to share with you from this project. And if anybody's interested in finding out more about the work, please get in touch with me, and I'll gladly talk to you for hours about it. It's basically, my passion. It's what I do. So, how do we start then? How do we think about building a package of approaches that we might be able to use with pupils in schools to support their comprehension? Well, the National Reading Panel in the US did a huge amount of work, which still actually holds very true today. They did what's called a meta-analysis of a large range of studies to look at what was the consistent evidence showing as being effective. And they suggested that the strategies to focus on are these. So the instruction should focus on the ability to monitor your understanding, to cooperate, so to do peer learning, to learn together, to share ideas. Interestingly, what with this going on, using visual supports, so graphic organisers, semantic organisers, story maps, to spend time questioning, and not just answering questions like some of the ones I showed you earlier, but also generating your own questions, because it's a really good way of testing how well you know something, is to be able to try and ask the question a little bit simpler. And looking at story structure, looking at how stories typically unfold and their components, and also looking at the ability to summarise and provide a gist of what you've read. Now, running alongside that is what's called the balance model, again by Duke and Pearson, and they talk about how you should go about introducing these strategies. And this is all, I imagine, fairly commonplace for the practitioners in the audience. What's suggested is that you begin with a very explicit description of a strategy and when and how it should be used. Then there should be opportunities for modelling and observing that strategy being used. There should be collaborative use of that strategy in action, so you work together with a piece of text. Guided practice and then gradual release of responsibility. So the tutor in the situation, or the more knowledgeable other in the situation, fades away from it, to the point where somebody can become independent in using that strategy. Now, one approach that really takes that on board is reciprocal teaching. Now, you may have come across this now. It's also called reciprocal reading. It's often used in guided reading groups. Originated in the US. And it really does follow that pattern of introducing a strategy, practicing it, and then gradually taking that support away so that learners can do that independently. Now, bear with me. Got a little bit overexcited with my animation. Check this out. What happens is you've got groups of learners, so usually 4 or more, and those learners will each be assigned a role. So when you're engaging with a text, you've all got the same text in front of you. One of them will be assigned the role of a predictor, and it's their job to make some prediction questions, or to make some predictions about the text, maybe based on the title, or the pictures, or the structure, or some of the clues within the text. You also have a person whose role it is to be the clarifier. So somebody who's willing to sort of stop the text and actually say, actually, what does that mean? Let's go back to that. Should we look at that together? Does anyone know what that means? To provide that space for exploring those uncertainties. Another of the learners is assigned the role of a summariser. So at different points in the text, thinking about best ways to kind of convey the overall meaning. And then the fourth role is the questioning role. So they are taking the lead on forming some good questions about the text. Now, what's important is that over the course of a number of weeks, students get the opportunity to be in each of those different roles. So, the predictor might become the clarifier. The clarifier might become the summariser. I had too much time on my hands yesterday. You get the idea. So you swap roles. You get to experience those different strategies. And the tutor is there at the beginning, modelling it, supporting it, but gradually fades away. So, that's reciprocal teaching. Now, in the work that we did, we supplemented that approach with a variety of different games and activities so that there was an opportunity to do the reciprocal teaching conversation, but then we reinforced some of what was being said through those games and activities. So prediction bingo was a hit. Dotty dust, I know. There's all sorts of different things. These are just a sample of some of the things that we offer the children to play with, to have fun with after those discussions. Oh, now, why I think this is important, why I think reciprocal teaching is important, why I think this opportunity to have a structured discussion, to take on different roles. Well, it aligns with this idea from Mercer in 1995. That what you do when you have a reading group like that, when you have those learners working together, is you provide a space. You provide a joint thinking space. It's got a fancy name, the intermental development zone. But basically, it's a space where you're all working towards the same goal. So you're all working towards trying to make sense of text. You build it up over time. It's dynamic. It's ever-changing and moving. And it's based on context and knowledge. So the idea is that you're thinking together. You're interthinking. So it's a sharing of perspectives to enrich each other's understandings. And that takes us really nicely through to some of the approaches that have been shown to be effective in supporting vocabulary in particular, because they also provide these spaces for that kind of talk, for that kind of discussion and dialogue. So Graves talks about a 4-component approach to vocabulary instruction, which involves teaching individual words, teaching strategies, working on just awareness of words and kind of an interest in words and a quizzical kind of approach to looking at words, and also providing rich and varied language experiences. Now, the approach that we've used in our research, and I know that other researchers in the UK have also used this, comes from the US, from Beck, McEwen and Kuchen. It's called the robust vocabulary instruction. Now, you may well have heard of Tier 2 words. So this is where we use what's called a Tier 2 word. An example is here, hesitate. These are words that might be actually a little bit difficult at the time. So it might be a little bit beyond what you would typically expect children of that age or that learners of that position to be engaging with. But critically, these are words that are useful. You can use them in lots of different ways, in lots of different contexts. They're high frequency, you are going to come across them, so they're valuable. Now what this picture demonstrates is the idea that if by teaching these words and working with this level of word, actually you're going to end up talking about lots of other words. So you have this kind of fountain or umbrella effect. So you're not just teaching the word hesitate. By doing that and having that discussion, you're going to end up probably saying things about the word stop, wait, pause, freeze, uncertain, and so on. So you're building actually quite a rich network of word meaning. Now, Alex Quigley's book, which I've got a recommendation at the end, some slides, Closing the Vocabulary Gap, which you may have come across. So he was at Huntington School in York, he's now at the Education Endowment Foundation, provides some really lovely examples and ideas around working with Tier 2 words, and provides this sort of chart for, just as a starting point I guess, of the first 60 words from something called Coxhead. So you've got lots here to think about. So these are those types of words that are difficult but useful and can be explored in different contexts. So what I've given here is a bit of an excerpt from one of the guidelines that we gave to our teaching assistants about how you might go about introducing a new word and working with a new word in your discussion groups. I'm not going to go into detail. We then worked with them to, it's not dissimilar to what's going on up here, to produce visual maps, graphic representations, graphic organisers relating to that word. And what we tried to do is, it was a collaborative thing, so a big piece of paper, tutor-led, and the learners could contribute what they wanted to it. It might be that they might say, okay, this is an example of when I felt that word, in this case it's ambition. Might talk about their own ambitions, might talk about phrases that relate to ambition, repeat that, and so on. So you can put all sorts of things in there. When we've used this approach with learners who have Down syndrome, we've also included lots of tactile objects, actually just sticking things on the page, all sorts of different things to help create that really rich, meaningful representation. Now, we haven't used this in our research, but it's one that I'm thinking about using potentially, and some of you might use already, is the Freya model. So this is another form of graphic organiser, a way of organising ideas on the page, breaking it down into definitions of words, the characteristics, some examples, and some non-examples. So it's another alternative, really. There's lots of different. Now, as well as looking at word meaning, of course, in the English language, words don't always mean what you would expect them to do, and depending on context, can mean quite different things. We have many idioms, we have a lot of figurative language. So in our work, we also have done some activity around idioms, jokes, riddles, simile, metaphor, and so on. And surprisingly, I don't know if anyone's used one of these. It's a piece of plastic, but the kids seem to love it. All it does is you pop a card in the top, and then at the bottom it's magically flipped over. Huge, most favourite thing of all time. But anyway, Smartshoot produced it, and what we did is we used this as the centre of our discussion. So this was sat in the middle of the discussion group, and these were just prompts, little cards, little pictures with different idioms and different ideas to discuss. And what we tried to do is relate that to the text that they were engaged with today. A couple more things to share with you. So, moving on now to look at words in their context and look at how we might infer meaning of words in its context. There's some work by Ewan and Oakhill, and we very much inspired by that. And we provided, not obviously they didn't read my story, they had much more exciting stories to do, but we provided a story, and then we would deliberately splash on the page, or sometimes we turned it into symbols, or we played around with it so parts of the text weren't decipherable, you couldn't read them. And then the discussion then happens around, well, what do we think could go in that spot? What do we think would be a suitable word or a possible word that could go in there? And then we also did some work with some little emojis, providing, again, just a visual cue to prompt discussion, where at different points in the story we do like a think aloud exercise, where we would ask the children to stop and consider what kind of emotion the character might be feeling. And you'd start by just putting one of these emojis in place, but then that is the focus of the discussion. We did a lot of work on metacognitive strategies. I'm not going to go into too much detail today, but we did things about when to look back and how to look back effectively, when to reread. We had lots of things like this, worksheets, just again providing a different framing for this. The ideas factory, there was the thought train, there was all sorts of things. But it's to provide just a worksheet or a way to, again, scaffold some of those conversations about the type of strategies you might use. Children created their own strategy cards and wrote in their own words what that strategy meant to them and how they found it useful or not useful. Sometimes they didn't find the strategy useful, that was fine. But it was a chance for them to record how they were using the strategy. And then also one of those strategies, which I think has got a quite growing evidence base actually, is around mental imagery and creating images, not just in our minds but also physical images. So again, this is work from Jane Oakhill actually, which it's been inspired by. So we did a lot of work with our pupils about actually taking time to look at images, taking time to look at pictures, at illustrations, looking at how that information related to text. Then we gave them some incomplete pictures to complete, so they had a starting point and then they had to imagine in their mind how they would go about finishing that picture up. And then we gave them the opportunity to draw pictures just from scratch. And then we took the paper away eventually, and then it was about creating pictures in their mind and then trying to describe what they could see in their mind. Just conscious of time. And then finally, this isn't one of mine at all, this is one that I found online, but I really liked it because it really typifies an approach that we have used in some of our more recent work, which is story mapping. Again, not dissimilar to what's going on over here. So taking a story, and again, when we've used it collaboratively, so maybe a group of 2 or 3 children and a tutor, a big piece of paper, and you're providing a space for talking about the story, but also mapping it down. Now, this becomes important because if we think right back before about the memory demands of comprehending, what this does is it provides you with a bit of an extended memory space. You don't have to hold it all in mind, you've got that in front of you. So it gives you a way to organise your thoughts and perhaps reduce some of that processing demand in your mind. And you get all sorts of different things, and the object isn't to draw anything. We had to spend quite a time with our TAs saying that you don't have to draw beautifully, just anything, just whatever's useful. So, good old time. It's never usually so hopefully I've been able to sort of share with you some of the things that we've used anyway and that have an evidence base behind them. There's lots of resources that I can recommend to you. There's something called the Connected Reading Scheme, which is based on Reciprocal Teaching. There's lots of really nice training videos actually from the BBC. There's Alex Quigley's vocabulary resources, Pine Corbett's work. I'm sure many of you have come from Pine Corbett before. He does a lot of work out and about, a lot of conferences. Really lovely stuff, looking at stories and looking at how to generate story ideas. This is the Smart Shoot, that lovely piece of plastic. And also some idiom work from Danielle Legway. Recommended reading? Well, I don't feel you have to read it, but it's there. There are lots of other really good books there that you might want to have a look at that have been written with practitioner audiences in mind. So you've got these ones here that are based on that vocabulary approach. You've got Reciprocal Teaching, Questioning the Author, and so on. So they're all a good read. So, I have got 3 messages. I didn't realise I'd done it. I've got 3 key messages. So, my messages are: making meaning from text involves a complex array of skills and processes. We are active constructors of our own personal interpretations, and sharing perspectives through discussion and joint inquiry can promote the development of rich understanding.